I want to give a warm welcome to Tony's family, in particular to his two sons. It's great to have you here. The Calvó-Armengol Prize was created to honor the memory of our friend and colleague, Antoni Calvó-Armengol, who was a professor at the Universitat Autónoma de Barcelona and a member of the Barcelona Graduate School of Economics, and one of the best scientists in Andorra's history. The three institutions, the government of Andorra, Credit Andorra Foundation, and Barcelona Graduate School of Economics, created this prize to honor his memory. The winners so far, Esther Duflo, Roland Fryer, Rash Chetty, and this year's winner, Matthew Gentzkow, share, I guess, with Tony the passion for understanding social interactions and how they affect our economic decisions. I want to thank Governor of Andorra and Government of Andorra and Credit Andorra Foundation for their help to make this prize alive and for their long-term commitment. I would like to thank the award jury, which was chaired by Professor Matthew Jackson and composed by Salvador Barbera, who is here with us, and Joel Sobel. I guess the quality of the winners so far is a reflection of the very careful job that they do. Today's lecture follows the first day of a two-day workshop on learning, communication, and social networks organized by Matthew within Barcelona Graduate School of Economics Summer Forum. Tomorrow the workshop will continue, and indeed Matthew will give another talk there. Barcelona Graduate School of Economics Summer Forum is a series of workshops that bring frontier research from all around the world to Barcelona, and we are very happy that this event is taking within the forum. Before leaving the floor to Salvador Barbera, I would like to thank everyone who helped with the organization of this event. Now Salvador will briefly introduce Matthew, and then we will have the lecture.
Thank you. It's a long day, but I'm very happy to be able to say a few words. Allow me to be somewhat formal at the beginning, reading what was the formal statement of the award, and then I'll introduce some short, more personal considerations. Matthew Gentzkow is a professor of economics at Stanford University. He earned his bachelor's degree in 1997, a master's degree in 2002, and a PhD in 2004 in economics from Harvard University. He took a position at the University of Chicago and in 2004. He moved to Stanford in 2015. He has been the recipient of a number of honors, including a Sloan Fellowship and the John Bates Clark Medal. He's a fellow of the Econometric Society and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and he has served on various editorial boards and is currently co-editor of the American Economic Journal, Applied Economics. Gentzkow research investigates the performance of the news media and its social implications. He studies the extent to which newspapers provide a full range of information to its readers, the source of media bias, and how the media influence decisions of voters. Gentzkow and his co-authors use textual analysis in a novel way to construct a measure of the bias of newspapers and demonstrate that the measure is consistent with less formal measures of the media slant. They demonstrate that readers seek out sources of news that are consistent with their tastes. Surprisingly, the research shows that the newspaper's slant is associated with characteristics of its readers rather than characteristics of its owners. Gentzkow links the introduction of television as a source of news to decline in voter participation and tracks how biased information translates into how people vote. He's also made important contributions to other topics in particular empirical work on the value of commercial branding and the theory of persuasion. Having read this more formal statement, allow me to be a little less formal and speak to you about my feelings as a jury member, which I know are also shared by Matt Jackson and by Joël Sobel, the two wonderful colleagues with whom I have had the privilege to share membership in the jury for the prize since its creation. First of all, it is a feeling of gratitude to the Barcelona GSC for allowing us to perform this exciting task, and above all, to let us in this way honor Tony. It is hard to transmit to those who had not the privilege of knowing him what Tony meant for many of us. He was simply amazing in many ways, not only academic, and the more you know about these other dimensions, the more amazing he becomes. But I will just stick to his characteristics in the scientific front, not to get too emotional. Let me just say that he was more than an economist, but a true social scientist, widely knowledgeable in other fields beyond our discipline. He was a strong theorist, but his eyes went well beyond theory, and his aspirations included relevance and practical applicability of any new knowledge that he learned or was able to produce, applications to the world, but also to his beloved Andorra. Our work as a jury over these years has allowed Matt, Joel, and me to travel through the new territories of economic discovery that have been conquered by the very best young researchers of our time, adding to the feeling as we identified the deserving winners of this prize that we were seeing more and more how much of a pioneer Tony was in calling for an enlarged scope for economics. And this year's winner gives us, once again, an exceptional example of the growing scope that economics is taking as a social science. Matt Gentzkow's work could have started and ended as a special example of I/O applied to a specific industry, the media. Instead, he took his research to new heights, turning the economics of the media into a complex field of research in many directions, developing new methods of analysis, exploiting hard-won data of extreme complexity to analyze questions of social relevance for economics, but also for politics, for a better understanding of social polarization, for the improvement of democracy. And this is only one of the fields, the one that first made him famous, but he's worked on. There are others, and much more to come, I'm sure. So thank you, Matt, for accepting this prize. And now the floor is yours.
Thank you, Neze, especially for organizing this, and Salvador for the kind introduction. Thanks, everybody, for coming. And thanks especially to Tony's family for being here. It means a lot to have you here. It's a tremendous, humbling honor to receive this prize, and especially to receive it in Tony's name. He's somebody whose work has been a real inspiration. I think the workshop that we have today and tomorrow, you can see threads running through that work that show the continuing influence of his work on economics and on many different areas. I think the great theme that runs through Tony's papers, for those of you who don't know, he's a great theorist who worked especially on networks, and the theme running through it all is the importance of social connections for economic outcomes, for other outcomes. When networks are densely connected, productivity is high, individuals find their way to economic opportunities. When networks are fragmented and divided, we get inequality and stagnation, and economic outcomes are worse. And also beyond just economic outcomes per se, in Tony's work and in the work of lots of other people who have built on it and developed the same kind of themes, social connections matter for social welfare much more broadly defined, for crime, which Tony worked on, for health, for conflict, and for the health of democracy. So I want to sort of pick up on that theme today and think about this particular moment. I think we see, looking around right now, it's a time where many of those connections feel like they're increasingly strained. Connections between left and right, politically, between North and South, between religions, between rich and poor, educated and not. And I think the thing we take from Tony's work is that those kinds of divisions can really matter, and also that in order to understand them and diagnose what's going on and think about how we can make things better, you have to really dive in and understand the details, and the details of the structure of the network, the details of how people communicate and how people form beliefs. So I want to talk about a particular research project today which picks up on these connections in the specific context of politics and in the even more specific context of political language and political speech. And the work I'll talk about today is some recent work we've been doing. It's joint with Jesse Shapiro, who's at Brown, and Matt Taddy, who is a statistician at the University of Chicago. And so by political speech, we mean basically an observation that anybody who follows politics in the US or in Europe in different ways, I think would make pretty obviously, which is people on opposite sides of the political spectrum use language differently, use different language to describe the same things. In the US, if people are talking about cutting taxes, Republicans like to talk about tax relief because that sounds like something good that you want, relief from these terrible onerous taxes. Democrats prefer to talk about tax breaks for corporations, tax breaks for the wealthy, because that sounds like you're giving some unfair advantage to somebody, and that's something bad that you don't want. In the immigration debate, Democrats systematically tend to call immigrants who are in the US undocumented workers, whereas Republicans would call them illegal aliens. Just today, the front page, or at least the front page of my iPhone on the New York Times was a story about the differences in the reactions to the recent shootings in Orlando, and the differences in the way they were being described by Republican Democratic politicians and Republican right and left-leaning media. The left has been consistently describing them as mass shootings, as this event is a mass shooting. The Republicans have been consistently describing it as a terrorist attack. Those two things feed very different narratives. A terrorist attack suggesting that Obama is not protecting us well from these attacks, we need to get tough and prevent them. A mass shooting linking it to previous such shootings that we've had in schools and so on in the US, and kind of leaning toward a narrative about the need to control guns in the US and to reduce these kinds of killings. So we see these kinds of differences systematically today, and today it's clear that these things, if we look right now, it's clear these things don't arise by accident, but they're the product of a very deliberate process. There's a whole industry of focus groups and consultants. These are memos from Frank Luntz, who is one of the most famous of these kind of political consultants, who have done research with focus groups to test different kinds of language and then distribute. These are memos that were sent to congressional candidates in the US at different times, basically giving you a recipe for when you talk about taxes, when you talk about healthcare, this is the language that you should use, this is the language that we've found to be most effective if you want to persuade people. And if you look at the data, so just to take a kind of particular example, from one of those memos, to give you the flavor, back in 2006, one of the big signature issues, kind of George W. Bush policy proposal on the table, was reforming Social Security in the US. That had heretofore been generally described as privatizing Social Security. Luntz's research and the memo that he sends to Republican candidates says you should not call that privatization. We're talking about private accounts. That makes people scared. It makes them think of Russia or Eastern Europe or bad things, winners and losers and companies. Instead, we should call this personalization of Social Security. and say that what we want to create is personal accounts. If you go then look at Congress, you see that people follow this advice. So if you take the full text of the 2005 Congress, count how many times personal accounts and private accounts were said by Republicans, by Democrats, you see Republicans basically only say personal account. Not sure what happened to the 5 people who said private account. And Democrats say private account basically whatever chance they get. And I think picking up on the question of whether this matters for anything, which maybe we'll return to just a little bit at the end, this kind of language that's introduced in Congress filters down into the media and potentially then out into the broader discussion and the broader political dialogue in the country. So this is just an example of 2 newspapers, the Washington Post and the Washington Times, the Washington Post being the more left-leaning newspaper saying private accounts, and the Washington Times, which is a very conservative paper, saying personal accounts. So the question that we want to pick up here, in a sense, is just very simply, is this something new? And coming back to the sense that this is a moment where somehow divisions and polarization seem deeper and somehow qualitatively different than they've been in the past, is this language part of that, and can we see this as part of that? There's a big literature looking for evidence of increasing polarization in lots of different places, in survey evidence on people's views on issues, on how they vote, on roll call voting in Congress, and much of that literature finds it's kind of an illusion, this sense that polarization is increasing. That on a lot of measures, voters are not particularly more polarized than they've been in the past. Congress, by roll call voting measures, is increasingly polarized, but it also used to be as much or more so polarized back in the past, in earlier years. So we want to see, how does speech fit into that picture? So the goals of this particular project are to measure trends in the partisanship of speech. We'll do that over a pretty long time period from 1872 to 2009 using the full text of the congressional record in the US. There's a sort of methodological side to this, which I'm not going to talk about a lot, but I'll give you just a little flavor of, which is that if speech is an example of high-dimensional data, in the sense that it's data from choices where the set of things you might have chosen, in this case, the set of words that I could have said or the set of phrases that I could have said, is very big. And that introduces some kind of econometric problems and computational problems that were partly, one side of this paper is sort of figuring out how to address those. Okay, so we'll talk about that at least briefly. So to dive then a little bit into the details, we're going to use this complete verbatim transcripts of everything that's said in Congress. There's a law in the US that says every word said on the floor of the Congress has to be transcribed and published in these volumes called the Congressional Record. Those are digitized, turned into text. It amounts to about 11 million speeches over this time period. We're going to do some standard kind of text processing stuff, remove really common words like and the and or, because those add computational cost and don't really tend to be very useful for this sort of thing. We're going to combine similar words like terror and terrorism into their kind of stems so that we extract a little bit more information. And we're going to do what seems like kind of a crazy thing, but is standard in this literature in a sense, and treat the sort of rich, complicated sentence structure of a document and just collapse that to a count of every 2-word phrase used in that document. So this is sort of the background, I think, in the literature on text analysis is this method of treating text as counts of individual words or phrases or features tends, if you're interested in prediction, to extract most of the important information. And the marginal return to trying to take more account of sentence structure and grammar and other stuff tends to be pretty small. Okay? So that, if you imagine it, we go from a bunch of big books sitting on a shelf to now we have a vector, a matrix of numbers, which is for each speech given in Congress over this period. We know a vector of counts of all of the different phrases that were said. What are we going to do with that? The basic idea is going to be to borrow some tools from machine learning. So think about the field that deals with things like how do you teach a computer to play chess, or how do you teach a computer to tell the difference between spam and not spam in your email. In this case, we're going to apply those same kind of methods to ask a computer, how could you tell somebody's party from the way they talk? How could I use the frequencies of these phrases that you said to predict your political party? Once you have that sort of predictive model, you can then think of what does it mean for a phrase to be partisan? It's a phrase that if I hear you say it, gives me a lot of information about whether you're on the right or the left. So if I hear you say private accounts in 2005, I can be pretty sure you're a Democrat. If I hear you say personal accounts, I can be pretty sure you're a Republican. And then we'll have a measure of the overall partisanship of speech in a given year, which is just the odds that I can guess correctly your party based on some fixed amount of speech. If I get to hear 100 words in 1900 or 1950 or 2000, how well could I do at guessing your party? So just to make that a little bit formal for those of you for whom this will be helpful, and for those of you who it won't, don't worry about it. The model we're going to have in mind is, again, a kind of crazy representation of speech, if you think about it, or of language, which is just, we're going to represent the speech in Congress as draws from a multinomial distribution. So each phrase that I say is an independent IID draw from some multinomial process. If I gave this lecture that way, it would not be very interesting. It might sound like I am giving it that way, but it would be even worse if I actually did this. But again, from a predictive point of view, this is going to capture a lot of the relevant information. And what that means is, in the context of that model, the kind of key difference is across all of the phrases you could say, there is going to be a vector of probabilities Q for Republicans and a vector of probability Q for Democrats, QP here. That might depend on some characteristics. It's going to vary over time. And the question of interest is, how different are those two vectors for the two parties? That's what's going to basically determine how well I can predict your speech from your party. And then we can go from there to what will be our main measure of partisanship, which is what is the expected posterior that an observer who doesn't know the party of the person speaking would assign to their true party. That is, what on average will be the odds that I can correctly guess your party from your speech. So rho here, which is just of the times that phrase J is said, what share on average will they be said by Republicans, would be the posterior you would form if you heard just one phrase, and it turned out to be phrase J. And then pi, which is our overall measure, is the expectation of that over now all different phrases and over the possibility that the speaker might have been a Republican or might have been a Democrat. Okay. So that is our target. That's the thing we want to estimate. We now have a bunch of data on repeated draws from this statistical process. And if we know Q, we're done. So the question is, how do we estimate Q from the data? And this is where the sort of methodological bits of this paper are going to come into play. So what might you think about doing if you have this kind of object of interest? The natural thing to do would be to just plug in the empirical analogs of all of the objects that we need. Q is just what share of the things that Republicans said were phrase J. There's an empirical analog to that in the data. What share of the things that Republicans said were in fact phrase J? Call that Q hat. From that, we can form rho as this ratio, and we can form pi plugging those things in. That's the maximum likelihood estimator for this model. And it's efficient and consistent. So it seems like a good candidate to use. Now, the key trick to that is it is consistent as the amount of speech grows large, holding fixed the number of phrases, or the vocabulary. Or in other words, we need to have a lot of speech per phrase, because each of these individual cues and each of these individual rows have to converge to the truth. And the problem, the basic issue of high-dimensional estimation here, estimating a high-dimensional choice model, the problem is that we don't have lots of speech per phrase. We have something like 1 million phrases, and even with all the stuff that Congress people like to say, there's still lots and lots of phrases that are only said once or twice or 3 times. But suppose you didn't know that and you just, sounds like a good estimator, let's compute it. This is what you would get. So this pink line is this measure of partisanship. What are the odds that I could guess your true party after hearing one phrase, and the way it's changed over time. And so we spent, I won't tell you exactly how many months, looking at this pink line and thinking like, that's really interesting. Partisanship was actually much higher in the past than it is today. Maybe there's a little uptick, but even in 1940, partisanship was higher. Seems sort of interesting to us. And then at some point, we had the idea, just as a sanity check to make sure we're not doing anything wrong, let's do the following exercise. Let's take all of the party labels in the data and randomly reassign them. So just randomly choose who's a Republican and Democrat, reassign all those labels. Then, if we're doing things correctly, we should not see any partisanship between random groups, right? The truth of pi in that case is 0.5. It should be a flat line at 0.5. That turns out to be the dotted line in this picture. So at this point, we thought, something is not great here. These things are moving very much together. And it turns out that this is the essence of this sort of statistical problem that we face, which is there's a huge small sample bias in estimation when you have high dimensional choices. Why? So you could think about it in a couple ways, but just intuitively, what is the issue? It's when we do that plug-in estimator, we're treating the observed share of the time a phrase was said by Republicans as if it's going to be the truth, right? What would really high polarization correspond to? It would correspond to a case where some phrases are only said by Republicans, some phrases are only said by Democrats. Imagine that we have 1 million phrases and we had Republicans said 10 things and Democrats said 10 things. Then almost for sure, Republicans will have said something completely different and it will look like complete polarization. More generally, there are going to be lots of phrases that are mostly said by Republicans, mostly said by Democrats, just by chance. So you're going to get this huge bias. You can sort of see in the picture, just as a sort of preview of what we'll find, where do these pink and dotted lines actually start to diverge from each other is only at the very end of this series in these most recent years. And this is another, so there's one other paper in the literature, which is this paper by Suresh Naidu and Ethan Kaplan and Jensen that was in Brookings' papers. And they're doing something very similar to what we're doing here, looking at the partisanship of speech over time. It turns out that this issue with the estimator I just showed you is pretty broadly true across lots of similar things you might try to do, including the measure in this paper. So the pink line here is the published measure from their paper, and the dotted line is what you get in terms of, so you see this bias shows up there too. And so their conclusion from that paper was partisanship has been, of language, has been increasing, but it also used to be quite high in the past. And you can see that the used to be quite high in the past part of that looks like it's an artifact of this small sample bias. What could you do? You might think, if the problem is you have a bunch of phrases that are said rarely, why don't we just get rid of those and focus on the ones that are said a lot? You can do that. So this is sort of doing that successively. Suppose we only take phrases that people said 5 times or 20 times or 100 times or 1,000 times. And you can see as you remove more and more, the dotted line gets flatter. You are indeed removing the bias, but you're also throwing out a large share of the data. So by the time we drop 500, if we only look at phrases spoken more than 500 times in a given year, we've thrown out something like 99% of our data. And so the dotted line gets flat, but now there's a lot of noise in the pink line. And so we're losing a lot of information. So we're going to do 2 things as sort of alternatives here. One, which is not our main answer, but just as a way to look at the data, there's a sort of model-free solution to this, which is to use a leave-out estimator. So we didn't really talk through this, but another way to think about the source of this bias is that if you look at the formula for pi, it's basically q hat times rho hat. It's the product of these 2 things, and rho hat is an increasing function of q hat. So these 2 things are positively correlated, and the errors are going to blow this up So one way to do that is to say compute Q hat from person I's data and then compute rho hat only from everybody else's data. And that's going to make these things kind of mechanically independent, but also throw away a lot of information. The main thing that is going to be our preferred estimator is instead to write down a little more structure, treat this as a choice problem, and then, so we'll have a kind of logit choice model of the choice of speech, and then we're going to use some standard approaches from statistics, using penalties and the likelihood to try to control the bias, and using some approximations to be able to compute this like choice model with 1 million choices in a feasible way using distributed computing. Okay. So that's the technical part of the talk. Let's now look at the results and kind of come back to the substantive question here, which is how has partisanship of language changed over time, and is there really something different, new happening today? So I'll show it to you in 2 steps. This is the leave-out estimator that I mentioned, and you see here that dotted line is now flat at 0.5, suggesting we've kind of gotten rid of this bias, but there's also a lot of noise and things are bouncing around. This is the estimate from our model. So squeezing out the rest of that noise, this is the estimate of partisanship over time. And what you see is not at all what we expected to see when we started this project, which is there really is something different today relative to the past. So if you think of this as a measure of how partisan is speech, that is not 0, it's not equal to 0.5, but it's been roughly constant over time, and there's a sharp and dramatic change that happens in the mid-1990s. So we thought, one hypothesis, I think the hypothesis we went into this with is that, maybe the partisanship of speech is another manifestation of polarization in Congress. There's some underlying dimension of how polarized are Congress people. We can measure that with roll call votes. And this is another measure of that, and maybe they're going to sort of look the same. Instead, this looks totally different. To think about the magnitude, if you look at the numbers on this figure, this looks like a big jump, but it's only jumping from 0.505 to 0.525. Is that a big change? Does it matter? Well, remember, this is, what is the chance I could guess your party if I heard you say one phrase? So there's some chance I said, good morning, and then you're kind of out of luck, right? So, no matter, even in a very polarized world, it's going to be hard to guess somebody's party if you hear just one phrase. But suppose you could hear me speak for a minute or 2 minutes or 5 minutes. What are the chances you could guess? So that's sort of a way to, once we have this model estimated, we can answer that question for any fixed amount of speech, right? What are the chances I could guess your party if I hear you say 50 phrases, 100 phrases, 1,000 phrases? So this plots that magnitude for different numbers of phrases, and then the different lines are how that's changed over time. So think about a typical 1-minute speech in Congress. A short speech is about 25 phrases long. In 1874, if I heard someone give that kind of speech, the chance that I could guess their party was about 52%. In 1990, it was basically exactly the same. Hadn't changed at all. Between 1990 and now, it's gone from 52% to 75%. If I could hear you say, maybe 3 or 4 minutes of speech, I could guess your party basically for sure, whereas in the past, I would have had maybe a 55 or 60% chance. So in that sense, in this sort of statistical sense, that's a big change, at least as measured by this predictability kind of factor. This is the comparison, just to kind of have this in mind, with what you would find for roll call votes. So this is kind of a famous literature in political science looking at, if you look at how politicians vote, another way to think about how polarized is Congress is how differently are the Democrats and Republicans voting? Are the left and right sometimes crossing over and voting with each other, or do they basically always vote separately? And so this is a measure of that for the US House and the US Senate. And you can see it's also been increasing recently, but it used to be quite high in the past. And also, when it started increasing is something like 1960. So the dynamics of this picture and the dynamics of this picture are very different. There's something that's different about speech. And it's not just tracking polarization. This is just saying, if you look across people, the two are very correlated. So somebody who looks right-wing on their roll call votes is indeed very right-wing sounding in their speech. That cross-sectional correlation is very high, but the time series dynamics are very different. Okay. So this to us was a surprising fact. And we've been spending the last couple of months basically trying to figure out what is going on here, what happened, what explains what's happening, and can we dig into the model and the estimates to try to understand what we see. So let me first just walk you through different ways of zooming in on the data and sort of trying to see what's happening. So one way we can do that is just, let's go look at what is partisan language in all these different years. I started with some partisan language that we hear today. What was partisan language like in 1900 or 1950? And so to do that, we're going to define, what does it mean to define, in this context of this model, the partisanship of a phrase, particular phrase in a particular year. We're going to define that in the context of the model to be, if I took that phrase out of the vocabulary, how much less well would I be able to predict your party? In other words, how much is that particular phrase helping to predict party? That's going to be our measure of partisanship. So we'll sort all the phrases by that and look at, okay, what were the most partisan phrases in different years? So somewhat at random, take the 60th Congress, which is 1907 to 1908. These are the top of the list for the most Republican and most Democratic phrases. Remember, I said we're doing this funny thing of dropping short words and cutting stems off things, so these are a little bit hard to read. Also, unless you're really, really good at US history, they probably make no sense whatsoever. But a good way to figure out what's going on in each of these years is to go look at the platforms of the Republican and Democratic parties, see what they said they were advocating, and see how they line up. So just to give you a flavor of what some of these are, the 1908 Republican Party platform has as its headline main theme the need to have better support and provision for veterans of recent wars, including the Spanish-American War, incidentally. And so a bunch of these phrases, if you go look at the speeches in which they're used, relate to that. Infantry war, Indian war, mounted volunteers, Spain, I think this is something like Spain should pay for our veterans. We have to pay something about the war, First Regiment, and so forth. On the Democratic side, the great theme of the platform that year was to free the government from the grip of those who have made it a business asset of the favor-seeking corporations. And so these phrases all relate to that in different ways. Powder trust refers to trust in the sense of collusive agreement among producers of gunpowder that they were trying to get rid of. The Bureau of Corporations is the predecessor to the FTC in the US, the predecessor of the antitrust agency, which they were at the time trying to strengthen. So you see this partisan language is reflecting these different agendas of the parties. If we fast forward 40 years, 1947, this is just after World War II. What are people talking about? The Republicans are talking a lot about foreign policy. We need to stop communism, Lend-Lease program, Britain, Germany. The Democrats are not talking about that at all. They're talking about something called the Fair Labor Standards Act, which was labor regulation that they were trying to pass, including a higher minimum wage. They were also trying to pass school lunch, federal funding for school lunches. So these, in some sense, this is a check. Things are making some sense here. Notice also an observation about these phrase lists, and you see this if you look across all the years. This is mostly about what we are talking about, not how we are talking about it. So these are differences in the topics. The Republicans are talking about foreign policy. The Democrats are talking about labor regulation. We're not using different words to describe the same thing. We're just talking about different topics. And our measure is going to pick that up, because if I hear you talk about national defense in 1947, I'm going to guess, he's probably a Republican. 1987, 40 years later, this is when there was a big debate in the US about aiding rebels in Nicaragua who were fighting against a communist government, the Sandinistas. Republicans were in favor of aiding them and systematically called them freedom fighters. The Democrats, who did not want to do that and were more supportive of the government, called them Contras. And so there's this big back and forth about that policy. There's also, people might remember, or I guess some people now are young enough might have read about in history books, this Reagan-era initiative called Star Wars, which was basically putting satellites in space to shoot down missiles, which was very controversial, and it acquired this nickname Star Wars partly because the technology didn't exist to do that, so it was sort of a fanciful thing, and so Democrats were calling it Star Wars as often as they could. Finally, if we get up to the current period, so 1995 is the first year, this is the Congress in which that big spike happens. So this is the first year of this new kind of phenomenon. We see much more different words for the same thing. And so if we just look, for example, there are a bunch of phrases about taxes. We have Republicans saying tax relief, tax freedom, big government, we don't want that. Democrats talking about tax breaks for the wealthiest, tax breaks for the wealthy, and so forth. Okay. So this is kind of clearly language that comes from those memos, basically, if you look at them. You can look at how the distribution of the phrases changed over time. One diagnostic here is this a change about a small number of really partisan phrases being introduced? Something like tax relief, if it's chosen deliberately, you're not going to be able to have a focus group come up with 70,000 new phrases to use. They could come up with some smaller number. And so what you can see in this picture is if you look at 1994, these are percentiles of the distribution. So it's really the extremes of the distribution that are jumping in 1994. Eventually the whole distribution is spreading out, but the like 0.999 percentile and 0.001 percentile are what jump here and here, consistent with some really partisan stuff being added to the tails. Another thing you could ask is this coming from new language being invented or just changing stuff that's been there all along? So another phrase which is very partisan in this period is death tax. There's a debate in the US about the tax that you pay after you die on your estate before you hand it on to your heirs. That was long considered to be a pretty uncontroversial form of redistribution. We only tax estates over $2 million or something. Generally, the public liked keeping that tax. And people who were trying to repeal it came up with the idea of calling it the death tax. And if you ask people, instead of should we abolish the estate tax, should we abolish the tax on people dying? That is, do you think it's fair to tax people because they died? Does that really sound fair? People say, no, that doesn't sound fair at all. Let's get rid of that tax. So that's an example of a neologism, a new phrase totally invented. Nobody had ever said that before in Congress, death tax. So we can separate things out and see that this is the partisanship of new phrases introduced since 1980. And you see those are much more partisan. So the new language that's coming in is much more partisan. On the other hand, if you take that out, the remaining language still increases in partisanship, so it's not solely about new phrases. Okay. Last thing I'll show you about kind of diving into this. Remember we said looking at the individual phrases, there seems to be this shift from what we talk about to how we talk about it. So we'd like to document that in some more systematic way. Differences in partisanship between topics and within topics. And so the way we're going to do that is basically manually define a bunch of topics, group the phrases that are all about taxes, phrases that are all about government, phrases that are all about defense, and then look at how have things changed within those groups versus between those groups. These are the topics that we come up with just kind of by hand, looking at what are partisan phrases over time. And if you do that decomposition, you see that this post-1990 change that we've seen is almost entirely within topics. So there is some, this also goes up. So you can increasingly tell somebody's party by what they talk about, but most of the action is on what words they use to talk about a given topic. And then we can, once we have these topics, it's sort of nice because we can zoom in and look at how have particular issues evolved over time in the way that we're discussing them and the partisanship of that language. So alcohol here is an example, just to show you not all things have become more partisan in recent years. There's a bunch of language about alcohol in Congress. I should say also, this is the top pink line is partisanship of that topic. And then this is just the frequency with which we use that language about that topic. So how much are we talking about it? How much are we talking about it? How partisan is it? So when did we talk a lot about alcohol in the US was in the 1920s and before, when there was a whole debate about prohibition. So we were debating for a long time whether we should prohibit alcohol. We decided to do that. We then had a bunch of Al Capone and gangsters and bad things happen, and then we got rid of that. So it's in those periods where we see alcohol as a really partisan kind of language, and not later. If you look at defense, language about war is really interesting, because when did we talk a lot about war? In 1944, in 1919, around the world wars. So there are these huge spikes in the frequency with which we're talking about those topics, but actually it was completely nonpartisan in those years. So even though the frequency goes way up, in that case it's not partisan at all. You couldn't tell from, if somebody was talking about war in 1944, it was very hard to tell what party they were from. So what does go up in recent years? Where is this change coming from? It's coming from these topics, basically. Taxes is the biggest one. Immigration, interestingly, doesn't actually move that much in 1994, but has moved a lot since then. Health, government, crime, and budget. So what happened? I guess there are two disappointing things about this talk and this paper. One is we can't really tell you what happened, and two, we can't really tell you whether any of this matters for anything. What people are saying in Congress, should we care? We don't have any great statistical analysis where we then put that on the right-hand side and show the language affects something else, for better or for worse. But I think that there's a pretty good circumstantial kind of case about what happened in the US in the 1990s and what is maybe the origin of this change. And it comes back to those memos and Frank Luntz and all this stuff I showed you at the beginning. So we have basically two hypotheses. You can think of lots of others. What might have happened? We've come up with a long list. Two sort of stand out to us as a priori the most interesting to consider. The first is, you see, what was that year that things spiked, 1994? That was not a normal year in the US Congress. It was the year that Republicans took control of Congress for the first time after it had been controlled by the left for 50 years. And that Republican takeover of Congress was associated with a huge change in strategy by the Republicans. It was led by Newt Gingrich, who became the Speaker of the House, and they created this platform which was called the Contract with America, which was all about basically those themes that I showed in the topic plots: taxes, big government, and so forth. And moreover, Frank Luntz, who sort of did all these focus groups and was an early innovator there, was the official pollster for Newt Gingrich and was deeply involved in that. So what this suggests to us is that one hypothesis is this is something like innovation, like technological innovation in politics. Somebody could have come up with this idea in 1984, but they didn't. In 1994, this technology of devoting explicit attention to very carefully choosing what kind of phrases we use was introduced and prompted this big change. So a couple of quotes. Frank Luntz was asked by, in an interview, do you believe that language can change a paradigm? And he said, I don't believe it, I know it, I've seen it with my own eyes. I watched in 1994 when the group of Republicans got together and said, we're going to do this completely differently than it's ever been done before. We called this thing that before would have been called a platform, a contract. We also changed a bunch of other language. George Lakoff, who's a linguist at Berkeley who studies these issues and has also advised a lot of Democrats on how to use language, asserts Republican framing superiority played a major role in their takeover of Congress in 1994, and that seemed to him to have been the key thing. So that's one hypothesis. The other is that happened around the same time as changes in the media environment. So up until the 1980s, there were no TV cameras inside Congress. Things were transcribed, but there was no video record of what was said. Starting in the 1980s, we had this TV channel that was introduced that broadcast live everything that happened in Congress. Everything was recorded, therefore permanently on video. That channel is called C-SPAN. Nobody watches C-SPAN. Like 0 people watch C-SPAN. So if your hypothesis was, now all of the American voters are sitting at home watching on C-SPAN, and so these guys, that's not what we're thinking of. But if everything is broadcast live on C-SPAN, that means if you happen to say something stupid, or if you happen to say something especially compelling and brilliant, either your opponents or your supporters can then use that video clip and put it in ads and repeat it over and over and over. So if you kind of zoom in, this is just zooming in on the plot I showed you before. What is the timing of this big change? The vertical lines here are the introduction of C-SPAN to the House of Representatives, C-SPAN 2, which is the Senate, and then the contract with America in 1994. It seems pretty clear that the kind of proximate timing is about the contract with America, but it seems plausible that this presence of TV cameras is reinforcing that and changing, making that effect bigger. So this is just another quote along those lines. Newt Gingrich was asked whether he would have become the Republican leader without those TV cameras, and he said no. Key to our strategy was having those TV cameras there and the ability to win a primetime audience. Primetime being, again, you said something on C-SPAN and now it gets rebroadcast on the nightly news. So we don't have any great way to test that. One thing you can do to just get some feel is say take the text of the contract with America, that document, look at all the phrases that appear in that document and say, what about those phrases? Were actually those the phrases that were being used? This is the frequency of those phrases, and you see it spikes. So indeed, in 1994, they're using that language a lot. And this is the partisanship of those phrases. So if you think of those phrases as a topic, you said, suppose I just got to hear somebody use those phrases, how well could I tell their partisanship from that? And the answer is very well. And that has a big spike right in that year. Okay, so as I said, the other big sort of obvious weakness of all of this is, does it matter? Do we actually care for any reason? And we have basically no evidence to offer you on that directly in this paper. But motivating us in the background is the sense that when two sides of the political spectrum start speaking in different languages, that can have an impact on how they think, and that can have an impact on the depth of these divisions. There is good empirical evidence that this kind of language doesn't stay in Congress, but diffuses through newspapers, through television, just as that example I showed you at the beginning suggests. That's a much broader phenomenon, and also into the broader public discussion, as we can see on the internet. So for example, there's a study of Wikipedia showing that Wikipedia entries have, depending on the point of view of the person writing them, partisanship that's related to this kind of language. So I guess it's just a concluding thought. If you wanted to find a part of the world to think about whether language matters for people's beliefs and identity, I think this is a pretty good part of the world to think about that. There's a long line of literature in linguistics and psychology and philosophy arguing that the language that we use shapes how we perceive the world, shapes our identities, shapes the extent to which we feel allegiance with a particular group, and also possibly divisions with other groups. Some of the best actual empirical evidence, by the way, on the impact of language on voting behavior, beliefs, identity is papers looking at the introduction of Catalan language in Catalonia and how people who grew up going to school in Catalan ended up behaving differently, voting differently, marrying different people relative to people who didn't. So I think bottom line for us is there's been a striking and dramatic change, and it seems at least plausible that the fact we are now speaking languages that are so different is contributing to the depth of these broader divisions that we see in society. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. We have time for a few questions. Okay, start from there, and then we go here.
So my first question is, in your analysis, you're taking all those expressions at face value, right? But then there are several expressions like Star Wars, for example, that could have been used by two sides, but by one in an ironic way, sarcastic way, and the other one taking it seriously, right? And then this has also evolved over time. So
So that's a great question, and it comes back to this strategy of treating language as a bunch of counts of how often you say something. You lose a lot of meaning when you do that, and one of the kinds of meaning you lose is what is the context in which you said it and how did you say it. One answer is, in some sense, our data is going to pick that up, and the fact that it shows up as so democratic says that it's overwhelmingly being used in one way or the other. The other is, in previous work we have looked at and other people have looked at, how much do you gain in predictive power by disambiguating those uses, and so separating cases where you're saying it ironically, putting it in quotes, depending on the context around it, and the truth is it doesn't matter very much. So it ends up being noise that washes out in large samples. The share of the time that language is used in its sort of simple, straightforward, sincere sense is quite high relative to the share of the time it's used in these other ways. Yeah, sir.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I think language has many aspects, as you pointed out, and the role of language in politics and other aspects of life is difficult to dispute. My question is about why interpret difference in speech or differences in agenda as a measure of partisanship, as opposed to something like difference in positions on a given agenda item as a measure of partisanship, or difference in understanding of a given phrase as a measure of partisanship. And I'm sure you can make up many other things. In the textual analysis, is that going to get at the partisanship by interpreting difference in speech as a measure of partisanship?
Good, great question. So I think this comes back to something subtle, which probably I'm still need to find a way to make clear, which is we are not saying that our measure is going to detect some underlying polarization in ideology or in views on issues. Indeed, the roll call voting measures that I showed you are widely thought of as a picture of how big are the differences on issues exactly. How big is that polarization? And so our goal here is not to say, can we use speech to measure that underlying variable? Our goal is in some sense much less exciting, which is just purely descriptively to tell you how differently do Republicans and Democrats talk. Full stop. The answer turns out to be the extent to which they use different language has changed dramatically. And I think that then, exactly as you're saying, raises the question, what does that mean? How do we interpret it? We're trying to do some work here to drill down and at least get a feel for what it might mean. But I think, could it be something completely trivial that doesn't matter for the kind of divisions that we're talking about? Yes. Could it be more consequential than that and relate to the broader kind of polarization that we've seen in society? We think the answer to that is also yes. And we're kind of doing our best to discriminate as best we can here, but we can't do that perfectly.
Just to take an extreme example, if language is spoken in Barcelona and Paris is different, does it mean it's partisan?
I think, again, no. But if in one year France and Spain speak the same language, and we see that all of a sudden 5 years later, the French now speak French and the Spanish now speak Spanish, that's going to have an impact on the extent to which the people can communicate between those countries, on the extent to which their identities are different, on the extent to which people may perceive things differently. I mean, actually, that is the sort of experiment on which there is some empirical evidence. So there's like a famous historical study of the integration of language in France. France is a place where you have the change in the other direction, where people used to speak all different languages, and then quite deliberately, there was a change by the central government directed at homogenizing the language and getting everybody to speak French. And without careful, large-scale statistics, but in sort of a historical study, the people who have studied that argue that that change had a big impact on people's identity and the extent to which France sort of had some cohesive national identity. So absolutely, depending on what you mean by partisanship, it might or might not be a good measure of that. Our measure of partisanship is simply a description of how differently do these two sides talk.
There's a question there? No? Yeah.
Giacomo?
So, given how strong the spike is in all this data, this is more a curiosity than anything substantive. But I wonder, to what extent is greater partisanship identification from short sound bites coming from the fact that, Jennings Bryan used to talk in 30 minutes speech and Donald Trump talks in 140 character tweets. So, of course, you have to establish your partisan personality in a much shorter segment because you've stopped giving, even Martin Luther King spoke in long speeches.
Yeah, so I guess one, sadly for us, Donald Trump is not in our data. Two, this change obviously happens before the internet, before Twitter. So anything about that technological change per se, I don't think is driving this. If we think something like C-SPAN and the move to these more televised soundbite kind of talking was related to this, which we think it plausibly is, then you might conclude that those subsequent changes might have accelerated this further over time. And so it's sort of an annoying fact that our data stop in 2009. We will extend the data series forward and see what's happened in more recent years. But I don't think those things are what's driving this spike, just because of the time. Xavier?
Sure.
My impression is that and I don't know if it could be corroborated or identified somehow very clearly, is that the influence of the TV channels Fox and CNBC is major, or has to be major in all the things you are portraying, right? And so I don't know, how could we go about, so because the way that the language has been codified, I think the expansion, without Fox and CNBC would be another thing. No?
Yeah. Yeah, so that's something I didn't put up there or didn't emphasize is another big change that happens in the US is the introduction of Fox News and then MSNBC, which was an existing channel, kind of moving to the left in response, and we now have much more partisan television news than we used to. I think that's a better hypothesis than Giacomo's hypothesis, but it runs into the same problem of timing a little bit, which is this big spike in the data starts in 1994. Fox News is introduced in 1996 and grows, kind of gradually over the next 4 years. So I don't think you could quite explain the spike with Fox News, but again, could that be a reinforcing factor that's complementing this? Absolutely. It's part of what's surprising here is that if I told you the contract with America was all about using language and this innovation, and what we saw in the data was there's a spike in 1994 and then it's flat. Or there's a spike in 94 and then it went back down. Right? So, that's interesting. There's some fact about the contract with America. Great. But the fact that it goes up and then it just keeps going up. And what we know kind of anecdotally happened is the Republicans introduced this innovation. A bunch of Democrats, including George Lakoff, whose quote I put up there, react by saying, oh my gosh, we just got our clocks cleaned in this election because these guys figured out this new way to use language. We better get on that bandwagon and figure out how to do the same thing. So they kind of imitate it. And then there's some sort of strategic back and forth. And somehow that process means that it keeps growing. The fact that you have these ongoing changes in the media environment yours and yours can be another part of why it keeps going up so much, I think.
One last question, was there? Or you're fine? Okay. Well, thank you, Matthew. Thank you,
Thank you, everyone.
for coming.